Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, David Goodhart. Now, I've met David a few times in the course of taking part in debates at places like the Durham Union, and I've always thought of David as a mensch, because when I'm with him in debates, I tend to find him simpatico and on my side of the argument. So that's good, isn't it, David?
That is good, yeah. I think I often am on your side of the argument.
Except, by the standards of some of the people on my show, I'd say you're kind of dangerously left-wing. I mean, I mean, for example, you're not Douglas Murray. You're not Katie Hopkins.
No.
I'd put you sort of more in the sort of squishy, soft right centre.
Sensible centre?
Yeah, well, that's how you'd brand it. And I mean,
Yeah,
tell me about your journey in politics.
I would now describe my politics in the way that the famous American sociologist, was he, or political scientist, Daniel Bell described his politics. I think this was back in the 1970s. He said, I'm a social democrat in economics. And he was an American, so he basically meant a regulated market economy. I'm a liberal in politics, and I'm somewhat conservative in social and cultural matters. Now, obviously, what being somewhat conservative in social and cultural matters changes a lot over time. I mean, if someone who is conservative on social and cultural matters 30 or 40 years ago would have been hostile to homosexuality, now such a person like me would probably accept gay marriage. So these things, a lot of these things, change very rapidly. But I think that's a rather an attractive balance combination. And it's one that, for all sorts of historical and contingent reasons, our party system has never really reflected.
Yeah.
I mean, you might say that there's something of that combination in Blue Labour. There's something of it in Red Toryism. I think it's the hidden majority in our societies, actually. And it's true. I know. I mean, I've come to this more centrist, more small C conservative view, partly through my interest in immigration, race, multiculturalism. Made me. I used to think of myself very much as on the left, or at least on the centre left. I mean, I was a screaming leftist as a student, and sort of moved to the.
Well, you sort of Trotskyite.
Yeah. I mean, my father was a Conservative MP, so I think there is some excuse for being a Trotskyist.
You did it to wind up Dad.
Yeah, and the fact this is. It sounds absurd, but it is actually partly true. I also became a Trotskyist because I didn't get into the Eton College first 11 cricket team.
Sorry, my jaw was dropping there. So you went to Eton?
Yeah, and I was very, very pleased to read a biography of John Stretchy. He was a kind of middle-ranking Labour politician in the Attlee government, but he had been a very important figure on the far left in the 1930s. He was a big figure on the Marxist left. John Stretchy, I assume from the great Stretchy family.
Stretchy, yeah.
Hugh Thomas wrote a biography of him back in the 70s or the 80s. And I was very, very pleased to read, when I read it a few years ago, that he had become a Marxist because he didn't get into the Eton College first 11 cricket team. So there was some...
But this is the thesis of Another Country, isn't it? The Julian Mitchell play. That the reason that Guy Burgess turned is that he was rejected in some way or other by his posho public school. And so he took revenge on the establishment that had destroyed him.
Yeah.
So, and you are that person. You are the real latter-day Guy Burgess.
No,
you were.
I was just sort of a confused, privileged child who, for a certain period of time, held some idiotic views. And I think, actually, giving you a little bit of insight into the mentality of... if you've been a Marxist when you were young, you understand, I think, at least to some degree, jihadism, Islamic extremism, the certainty of knowing the truth about everything around you. When you're a 22-year-old Marxist, part of the attraction is that you have a kind of ready-made family of comrades, and you also have the truth. And it makes you... One of the positive things about about it is that it makes you interested in everything. You have to know, a little bit about something in order to proselytize the faith.
That's interesting, yes. And also you have to get quite adept at intellectual gymnastics, don't you? Because in order to be able to sort of talk the dialectic, you really have to kind of...
You have to learn how to argue, It's a good mental gymnasium in some ways. I mean, reading Althusser, I remember always thinking, was a bit like kind of doing Latin or Greek. I mean, you didn't understand it, but but it was still good mental exercise.
It's not meant to be understood, this stuff, is it? It's just a kind of... It's a new way of thinking which denies reality and imposes this narrative on events which are divorced from logic or reason.
Well, obviously they think very differently from that, but it has some of the characteristics of a religion. I mean, in that you have the original sacred texts, the texts of Marx and Engels themselves, and then all of the many interpretations by different, as it were, scholars over the last 150 years or whatever. And then you have your kind of priesthood, and you have your senior interpreters of the holy texts, and obviously they think that this does have those texts do have the key to reality. And
they think that, but we know that they don't.
Well, we know that they don't have the key to contemporary reality. I mean, they
or past reality. I mean, communism has failed everywhere it's been tried. It's an absolute abomination. Can I just have a brief rant here? The wife and I were coming back from our Pilates class last night, and we were listening on the way back, faute de mieux, to Radio 4, who are currently talking about the 1917. And the way that the BBC talks about young Lenin, they would never do with young Hitler. There was this kind of affection
reverence.
for it.
There was a reverence,
It's like, well, he may have made a few mistakes, but
his heart was in the right place.
Yeah. I get angry about that.
Yeah.
Do you not? I mean, do you not reject your past?
I do. No, I mean, I listened to the same program, and exactly the same thought occurred to me. That not the point about Hitler so much as the the politics that he was developing when he was in London. It was about Lenin in London and the pubs he went to, and it was very kind of light-hearted in a way, but it was also about, it kind of completely glossed over the fact that the politics he was developing was extremely authoritarian. It ended up killing millions of people, and I think most scholars now would. I mean, there was a long period, I think, when people tried to protect Lenin from the blame for the terror, for forced collectivization, all these other things. But I mean, it did flow directly from the party replacing the people, and the party then decides exactly what to do. I mean, and the genocide against the kulaks. A lot of that work would have originated in the work that he was doing, that was described in that very radio program, the work he was doing on the land question in the British Museum. Yeah. So he was dividing up the peasantry into, those we could eliminate that probably wouldn't go along with the program, and those that should side with the workers' struggle.
So maybe you can tell me, as a reformed leftist, how you justify to yourself when you're sort of advocating this ideology. How can you live with the violence implicit in everything it does? I mean, Lenin was very much of the view that violence was a very necessary part of achieving his aims. He was absolutely ruthless. So you must have looked at the history and thought to yourself, well, am I really any better than the Nazis?
I mean, it was quite a long time ago, James.
But I didn't go through that phase, David.
No. I mean, I think they were somewhat more violent times. I mean, I'm talking about. I'm talking about the late 70s. I mean, not hugely more violent, but somewhat. There was kind of Northern Ireland. There was sort of mass pickets. There were, but I guess the history has been very violent. Would have been the kind of rather smug and silly justification for supporting. I mean, what is ridiculous is supporting violence in a mature democracy, in the name of something that obviously has the support of a tiny proportion of the population, perhaps slightly larger than we thought then, given the election of Jeremy Corbyn. That was the justification, and I remember, the inherent violence, the kind of class violence implicit in everyday life, the fact that people from working class backgrounds die 15 on average, whatever it is. It's actually, the gap has been reduced in the last 30 or 40 years, but then it would have been 15, 20 year gap in longevity between classes, or between sections of the people at different ends of the class spectrum anyway. And that would have given a sort of a false, I think now, but a false legitimacy to the idea that society is already incredibly violent. Even without people being shot, it's very violent, and it's all right to use force in order to end the current violence, as it were.
Yeah, I can sort of see that. I mean, and what the analogy you used for people who joined up ISIS, I think is quite a good one. That you're at an age where you're full of this testosterone and whatever, and you want to kind of express yourself through violence, and you need to find some kind of moral justification for it, and there's your badger if you've got Marxism or Islam. Yeah. So what would you say, given that you've been through this experience, to all those kids now who think that Uncle Jeremy Corbyn is going to save everything, and you see his kindly bearded face beaming out of photographs, not unlike kindly Uncle Joe smiling benignly over his nation, and there was that thing, was there not, at the peak of the terror, even people who knew on some level that Stalin was responsible for it, at the same time they thought, yes, Stalin cannot know about what terrible things are being done in his name. There was that sort of denial, I think, which is a key part of it, no?
Yeah. I think what I would say to them is, you need to look into your own soul and to consider how much of your enthusiasm
don't have souls.
Is kind of cultist, is almost at the level of a cult. And if you're intellectually serious, then you need to look much harder at the nature of our society. This really isn't the kind of caricature that is presented by much of the hard left. I mean, just some of the facts on welfare. I mean, we now spend twice as much of a much bigger cake on social security, on basic sort of pensions and welfare. We spent 7% of GDP back in the supposedly social democratic heyday when I was running around being a silly Marxist. We now spend twice as much. We now spend 14% of GDP on social security. We've invented whole new benefits. No, I mean, it's true that the welfare system isn't perfect by any means. It's trying to do all sorts of different things, and people fall between the cracks. And we have, whatever it is, 1.5 million people using food banks. I mean, we don't live in a perfect society by any means, but the kind of radical, really quite extreme solutions that are being put forward by the kind of momentum Corbynistas, I mean, as you say, they have a track record of not working, and also they are overestimating the violence that is being done to people. I think in today's society, we are a lot richer. We're actually a lot more social democratic in some ways than we were in the 1970s. Another example, I mean, inequality. People bang on about inequality the whole time, reasonably enough. I mean, I think inequality in this country is too high, but actually income inequality has not really changed since the late 1980s. And what's more, all the main political parties now believe in reducing it. I mean, go back to, obviously Labour has always been a more equality party. The Conservatives used to believe in a high floor. They were, Margaret Thatcher famously, in I think one of her last speeches in the House of Commons, made the point very powerfully that she did not want to sort of clip the wings of the rich entrepreneur, but she wanted a high starting point for everybody. So she was actually positively hostile to the idea of reducing inequality. Modern Conservatives are in favour of it. Now, that's not to say they necessarily put as much policy emphasis upon it as the Labour people do, but there is a huge consensus actually in our society. I mean, this idea of a kind of lurch to the left, I think doesn't really have any foundation, at least not in the socioeconomic stuff. In socioeconomic stuff, if anything, we've seen a convergence between the classes and the value groups over the last 20 or 30 years on things like the size of the state and public spending, and indeed the question of equality and inequality. I think it's partly because the middle class has become probably more dominated by the kind of more liberal professional middle class. So the business class probably forms a smaller proportion of the overall middle class than it did 40 or 50 years ago. And I think the working class has become less statist, less protectionist, partly because it's had to. I mean, when the working class has shrunk enormously, it's now probably, I mean, if you mean it in a technical sense of people doing kind of routine and semi-routine occupations, it's now only 20-25% of the population.
If that, I mean, does it even exist?
Well, I mean, it depends. It's a definitional thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you include poor people on benefit? Are they part of the working class, or is it just people who are at the bottom end of the labour market? Or you could extend it. I mean, if you judge it by self-definition, then on some versions of self-definition, 50 to 60% of the population are still working class. But it depends. Even there, it depends how the question is asked. If you're asked, are you working class or middle class, you get a very high response. 50 to 60% will say working class. If you give people more alternatives than that, it ends up being much smaller proportion. But my point is that where the momentum people, I think, are doubly wrong in that they see a kind of polarization in the socioeconomic sphere, which there hasn't been. If anything, it's the opposite. They are the kind of odd blip that needs to be explained, and I think they can be explained culturally. They are a product. Most of them are a product of the rapid expansion of higher education in the last generation or so.
Yes.
And they are, in a sense, in my view. I mean, I've just written this book called The Road to Somewhere, which is partly about the value divides between the people I call the people from anywhere, the liberal, mobile, highly educated people who tend to move away from home. It's part of our residential university. The dominance of residential universities means that to be successful often in this country, to join the professional middle class, means leaving. It means going to live in London or somewhere, one of the great metropolitan centres. And for that reason, the people I call the people from anywhere, who are quite a big, 20-25% of the population, they tend to have a sense of that their identities are so-called sort of achieved identities. They passed exams, they went to a decent university, they have more or less successful professional career. Their sense of themselves is kind of portable, because they have a kind of sense of being self-invented, and they are they tend to believe in kind of openness and autonomy, and social fluidity. They're comfortable with social change, and they have weak attachments to group. To some extent place, although they do create their own new places, the Brightons and the kind of parts of Bristol and Manchester, and they have their own sort of their own settlements, as it were. Indeed, we saw them emerge very strongly in the last election. The kind of political power of universities, and when we were a bit younger, the university seats meant Oxford and Cambridge.
Yeah.
It's now about 20% of all seats in the country.
We can talk about this more.
Yeah.
Don't apologise. We can talk about this more in the next section. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, David Goodhart, author, inter alia, of The Road to Somewhere.
Sonny Johnson brings her cutting-edge conservative commentary to SiriusXM Patriot every week on Sonny's Corner.
I didn't learn conservatism from Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, or Mark Levin. No conservative showed up in my school, my neighborhood, or anywhere in my intellectual orbit. I got all my conservatives from my unknowing but conservative principle practicing family and hip-hop.
Sonny's Corner, every Saturday at noon East on Breitbart News Saturday. SiriusXM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, David Goodhart, author of The Road to Somewhere. Bestseller, I see, from the Sunday Times bestseller.
Well, it crept into the hardback bestseller list for 1 week at number 10.
Nice.
But that means I can stick it on the paperback.
That's absolutely brilliant. I'm happy for you. I mean, obviously, I would have been happier had you been sort of conservative red in tooth and claw rather than sort of squishy conservative. But nevertheless, I'm happy for you because you're a mate. Now, it's interesting that you bring up universities, because I think that academe in both Britain and the US, and certainly in Australia and probably in continental Europe, most of the Western world, is responsible for so much of what is wrong with our culture, in that it has been hijacked by the liberal left. It teaches a form of understanding of our culture, which to me is alien and wrong. It's sort of the postmodernist kind of French philosopher nonsensical version of our culture, which teaches us to reject all authority, all established forms, and replace it with a kind of year zero approach. Is that a fair analysis of?
I think I think there is a problem with the helter-skelter expansion of higher education
By Tony Blair.
and even before, but it was they gave it they turbocharged it, and I think it has led to the domination of a certain view of the world, which is often quite illiberal, masquerading as liberal. Indeed, one might even say there is a kind of liberal blob that has been promoted by the expansion of higher education, which, as you say, is a sort of it's sort of society is to blame. It's anti-authority of all kinds, pretty much. Even, as it were, legitimate authority. It tends to see freedom as lack of constraint. I mean, it's a kind of it's a liberal baby boomer. I mean, I went to see the Pink Floyd exhibition at the V&A the other day. One of my daughters took me as a birthday present, and I mean, I was a great fan of the Pink Floyd, particularly. I mean, I thought Syd Barrett was a great hero when I was in my late teens, early 20s, and still do in a way. I mean, I think he's this marvellous sort of Pied Piper of that generation. But if you kind of follow the narrative, the kind of Roger Waters' lyrics, they also, I mean, that whole sort of that whole bohemian culture, that whole liberal culture, about tearing down the constraints of Edwardian Britain, as it were, the focus on kind of mad, and the kind of Ardy Lang, the straight world is mad,
yes.
The mad people are sane, all authority is suspect. The awful song, The Brick in the Wall. I was very pleased to see. I met Nick Mason, the drummer, at a education charity dinner not long ago. Catherine Birbal Singh was speaking. And I had a conversation with him about the awfulness of the "We Don't Need No Education" song that they got some kids at some school in Islington to sing.
It was a failing school, wasn't it?
Yeah, and he I'm very happy to say, he was clearly very embarrassed about that. And I noticed in the Pink Floyd exhibition there is no mention of it at all. I mean, you hear it as you walk past that. I'd already stopped really listening to Pink Floyd at that stage. Is it "Brick in the Wall" the album called?
It's called The Wall.
The Wall. I think. I mean, I could hear it, but there, virtually every other aspect of every other album was sort of carefully minuted, and anything interesting was sort of discussed. So, I suspect Nick Mason, who's now got quite interested in education and clearly doesn't believe the lyrics of that ridiculous song, was embarrassed by it. So there was nothing about it, just as there was almost nothing about Roger Waters leaving the band and all that kerfuffle. But anyway, that liberal, I mean, that it's a slightly different thing. I mean, but
if ever you talk to somebody about Pink Floyd, and their references are The Wall, you know that they're not a real Pink Floyd fan, because they're the kind of people who, when I was growing up, would have worn stonewashed denim, and probably have come from some foreign country like Germany or somewhere. They would like The Wall, but actually, real Pink Floyd fans, they like.
We've given up by then.
Well, exactly. You're familiar with Piper at the Gates of Dawn, at least.
Of course, yeah.
You've got Syd Barrett's solo albums.
Of course.
And obviously you think Dark Side of the Moon is probably their finest hour. My Pink Floyd story is, I'm sure I've told this before on this podcast, but I'm going to tell it again. I once made the mistake of explaining to David Gilmour at a party why it was that in fact their masterpiece was Atom Heart Mother, which I'm very, very fond of. He was quite scornful in his put down. He really wasn't.
I've met him. He's on the party circuit. I've met him at one or two parties too, and I've kind of blathered on about Sid Barrett, much to his and my subsequent embarrassment.
So tiresome for them. It's like, hello, I have had this conversation with stupid fans before. You realise. Yeah.
The one very good point made by somebody, they had lots of video recordings of people talking about various aspects of the band or their music, and there was a guy called Howard Goodall.
Yeah. The guy who wrote The Snowman, who did a very good TV series about the history of music. He's very talented. Went to my college.
Did he?
Yeah.
He made the very good point that the themes of The Dark Side of the Moon are completely at odds with the music. So the themes are all jagged and about madness and conflict, and the music is all warm and mellow. And I mean, okay, there's a few clanking.
Well, money
sounds,
is quite disturbing. But yes, I know what you mean.
But I thought it was a really good point. It hadn't occurred to me before. No? Complete mismatch between sort of form and content. Not form and content, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I rather get that with Radiohead actually, because I'm one of those people who doesn't really listen to bands' lyrics unless. Yeah. There's a particular song that I've sort of become obsessed with, but generally I ignore them because I think, well, then what do they know? They're just bloody pop stars.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the music that matters.
Let's not treat them as artists. I can't bear the way that pop stars are called artists.
Are you with me on that one?
Yeah, absolutely.
God, aren't we snobs? Aren't we the most appalling snobs? Because we went to Oxbridge.
I didn't.
You didn't?
No, I went to York.
Oh my God.
Yeah,
okay. Yeah, but you went to Eton, which is so you'd kind of been there. You'd kind of been there, done that. Can I just rewind a second, by the way, and have a Jacques Hughes moment? It's not necessary, to go to very good public schools and then sort of shit all over your father's generosity and giving you the best education in the world by becoming an out-and-out Marxist. And I know because I have offspring in this situation, and they're grateful for their education. It really gets on my nerves. People whose parents have forked out upwards of 30,000 a year because they care, because they love you, because they don't want you to have the squalor and stupidity of a state education, and they do it because they love you, and you repay them by rejecting everything that they sent you to the school for.
Well, I think it was probably a way of trying to attract his attention.
Yeah, I see.
I'm one of 7 children, so that may be something to do with it. Anyway, he thought it was a complete joke.
Do you want to give you a hug now? No,
but
how did they? Did you ever let slip in your revolutionary days that you had been to school?
I think I probably covered it up most of the time. Occasionally slipped down.
Did you change your accent?
Oh, of course, yeah.
When you were at school, did you have a posher accent than you've got now?
I don't know actually. I do remember. They were quite. It was a time when there was. It was an interesting time. I was at Eton in the early to mid 70s. And the cultural powers had definitely had leaked away from traditional, the traditional upper middle class. Yeah. And quite a few kids at the school went around putting on Cockney accents. There were there was a friend of mine who used to go up to watch Chelsea every other Saturday. And he'd put on the whole kind of bother boots outfit. There was particularly among the more kind of avant-garde kids, and obviously there was the whole, the huge, great sort of pop revolution. The prestige and status was all flowing down the other end of the class system, and it was quite interesting, sort of experiencing that. And part of that was, and you still see it today. The kind of Mockney accents of the the kids that go to Westminster and St Paul's, and
particularly Westminster. My God.
And although perhaps now it's more of a almost more of a sort of self-protection, that being if you talk like Jacob Rees-Mogg. One of the reasons why Jacob Rees-Mogg is such a sort of national figure, perhaps a little bit like Boris, is that they are seen as such sort of sort of flashbacks in a way, or they belonging to some other era.
Can you move though? I've talked to working class people. I mean, real proper working class people about Jacob Rees-Mogg, and they all say the same thing, which is that we quite like a toff. We quite like somebody who's not embarrassed about it.
Well, I think it's interesting that. I mean, I think it's because so many of the things that have alienated so many people in this country. I mean, I mentioned my book and the value divide. It's a bit simplistic and binary, although there is more light and shade if you actually buy the book. Between this anywhere group of highly educated mobile people who basically run our society, and that includes the left. That includes what we were talking about earlier, the kind of higher education.
So anywheres would be
blob.
People who went on mass for Tony Blair and people like that.
There could be centre-right versions. I don't know, someone who works for McKinsey who. Highly educated, very well travelled, perhaps worked in 1 or 2 countries, speaks 3 or 4 languages, very, very
Nick Clegg,
very free market.
is very anywhere.
Absolutely, yes. But I mean, there could be people way to his right economically who would also be anywheres. They believe in openness and the European Union and globalisation. Obviously, they've been beneficiaries of it, as well as the left-wing professor at university. I mean, of course, they don't like the fact that they're all part of the same dominant value group, but they are. I mean, they're all in effect.
I prefer to call them disgusting liberal elite, but it's the same thing.
They don't even necessarily have to have particularly liberal views. I mean, the McKinsey guy, might even be in favour of capital punishment, but he will certainly be in favour of the kind of openness that benefits the highly educated. He's part of the cognitive elite. I mean, one of the really interesting things, I think, is how both cause and consequence of the massive expansion of higher education has been the way in which one form of kind of human talent, if you like, has become so dominant. I mean, cognitive ability is the gold standard of human esteem now, in a way that I don't think it was really 50 years ago, or certainly not 100 years ago. Character, experience, moral virtue. I mean, obviously these things are not irrelevant now, but they have been demoted in some ways by cognitive ability.
I like that point. A friend of mine who lives near Oxford, we were talking about whether we wanted our children to go to Oxford or not. Not that they're going to get the choice, but if they could. And he said to me, I sometimes go and work in the Bodleian, and you really wouldn't want a child to go there. They are all kind of these workaholic little spods. They're all slightly freaky. And looking at University Challenge, you look at the Oxbridge teams, and they're all a bit weird. They're all a bit funny looking. They've all got sort of tics or they're a bit strange.
But we've got unbalanced. I mean, obviously we need, and it may be that technological society like ours perhaps needs even more clever people in the sense of analytical intelligence than we needed 50 or 100 years ago. But actually, in fact, somebody wrote me a letter about my book. Indeed, I borrowed his ideas for a piece I wrote in the Telegraph a week or so ago about this idea. It sounds a little bit naff, but the 3 H's, the head, the hand and the heart. A good society needs a balance between these sort of attributes.
Oh my God! Don't go there. You're sounding like one of those terrible, trendy, those super heads that comes into a school with 3 H's. I'm all for
Anthony Seldon.
Anthony Seldon, exactly. I'm all for the academic stuff, and I'm all for the hand stuff. It's when you start getting on.
Well, okay. Well, actually, to be fair, what he meant by the heart was the kind of emotional intelligence that you require to do caring jobs well.
Yeah,
to be a nurse, and this has been a serious problem, that actually those sorts of attributes have been undervalued. You might say traditional feminine virtues have been undervalued because of the anywheres are overwhelmingly the people of the public realm. They look down upon the private realm, which is why our family policy is essentially about parents being able to spend as little time as possible in the family.
They look down, David, often with very little justification for actually doing so. I mean, most of the degrees that people are studying are absolutely worthless. They're not. Even courses like English, which I did, and I think actually was once quite respectable in teaching you the importance of critical thinking, have now been effectively hijacked by all these kind of Marxist subgroups like feminist studies and so on. I had lunch with my old tutor the other day, and he was saying that if you're a generalist like he was, comfortable with with the whole canon of English literature, you really haven't got a chance of getting a job in academia anymore. They want narrow specialities, and every particular field is colonized by a kind of a certain interest group which looks after each other. I really worry.
It's funnily enough, somebody who I know very well who was a senior, sort of still is a senior politician, has a son who's just gone to Oxford. He studied history at Oxford, as his son is doing, and he says much of the time Oxford, Cambridge and do seem to be maintaining a standard considerably above the rest of the Russell group. I mean, one of my daughters went to Bristol. She used to do, she did history at Bristol. I think she did kind of one essay a month. I mean, I think still at Oxford.
That's Bristol.
Still at Oxbridge, you have to do an essay a week, and there's a higher workload. But this friend of mine was saying that when he did history, amongst other things, you did the whole narrative of English history, kind of from the Romans to 1950. Now, like everywhere else, you just do 2 or 3 modules. So you don't no longer do even the elite of the elite have a kind of sense of English/British history going back 2,000 years. No understanding of the kind of arc of history any longer. He was saying anyway. I merely report, but just to get back to the so we focused a bit on the anywheres and the domination of not just the university sector.
I like the way you brought it back neatly to anywheres and somewheres. Yes, okay, yeah.
Well, because we've talked a bit about the anywheres,
but the somewheres who are of great. Actually, you know what we're going to do? We're going to talk about the somewheres in the next section.
Okay.
You're listening to the Delingpole podcast. I really enjoyed the way that section sort of went off-piste into Pink Floyd and then back. That was good.
Yeah.
You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, David Goodhart, author inter alia of The Road to Somewhere.
Hey folks, I want to tell you about Breitbart News' Second Amendment newsletter, Downrange with A.W.R. Hawkins. Features the top gun stories of the week and guest columnists like Larry Pratt with Gun Owners of America or Marty Daniel with Daniel Defense. Each week also features the review of a firearm or a firearm accessory, something to make the exercise of your Second Amendment more enjoyable. You can subscribe to the newsletter for free at Breitbart.com/downrange. It'll show up in your inbox every Thursday.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, David Goodhart, author of The Road to Somewhere. David, one of the areas I think where I know we're on the same side is you were a Brexiteer, weren't you? You were for Brexit.
I actually voted Remain.
Did you really? You bastard. Okay.
But I do somewhat regret it now.
But you understand
I'm
why.
quite enthusiastic about Brexit now.
Are you?
Yeah.
Good man. Yeah. So we love you. See, more rejoicing in heaven, isn't there? No, so that's interesting.
Well, it's partly the reaction of the Anywhere Remainers. I mean, they have been so arrogant. They've been, you probably heard it from various people, people who said they woke up on the morning of June the 24th, this is, Europhile Remainers, and they thought they were living in a foreign country.
Yeah.
Briefly, at least for a few hours.
No, they still
what I
think
want
that.
to say to them is, and, I've got the data in my book, most of the somewhere people in Britain, and indeed more than the somewhere people, I calculate the somewheres, the people who tend to be more rooted, less well educated, tend to value security and familiarity, and tend to have quite strong local and group attachments, and often find social change, see change as loss rather than change as something exciting. As the Anywheres do. Anyway, brief description in parenthesis. There are surveys that have been done, opinion polls that have been taken on this very subject, and there is one that's been repeated several times, and it continues to get roughly the same answer. It goes something like this. It is admittedly a very leading question. It's that Britain has changed a lot in recent times. Some people say it feels like living in a foreign country. Do you agree? 63% of the population agree with that. I mean, this is astonishing and depressing in a way for a country that's going to stay basically stable and successful and rich as ours, that so many people feel that. I mean, I don't think they would have felt it 30 or 40 years ago. They do feel it now because of such rapid change in so many ways. And so when I hear these, usually highly educated, very affluent kids saying, oh, I felt like I was living in a foreign country, I just want to say to them, well, 2/3 of your fellow citizens, almost 2/3, feel that every blinking day.
Yeah.
I mean, and that is one of the big explanations for what has happened. And it is your fault.
Yeah, well, I'm obviously...
Not yours. I mean, the imaginary.
I knew you weren't cross with me, even though you were pointing your finger in a stabby way. I knew you didn't mean me. But this is exactly it. That I'm probably harsher on these people than you are. I think they're appalling. I think that they are an elite which has looked after its own interests for generations, which saw in Brexit the opportunity to pull up the drawbridge once and for all, and instead they got a very nasty shock when the people were not cowed and actually voted for their own interests rather than that of the elite. And I think these are people who are not used to losing elections or anything.
The extraordinary sense of entitlement of the kind of the anywhere class that they are. I mean, I have a spiel about my book, and I've just shown James the list of the extraordinary degree of anywhere domination of our politics and our policies over the last 25 years.
Just tell me a bit about that. Go through very quickly.
So the economy, we call it the knowledge economy. It's an economy that is designed for the interests of highly educated people. Meanwhile, everybody else, indeed, if there is a single reason for the Brexit vote, I would put it down to, if you had to explain it in one sentence, I would say the radical decline in the status of non-graduate employment over the last 20 or 30 years. So the knowledge economy is for the cognitively able, the highly educated. Meanwhile, we have the hourglass labour market for everybody else. So you've got 30-40% of jobs that are highly productive and generally well paid, and not all of them cognitive ability jobs. Actually, it could include working on the production line at Nissan in Sunderland.
This must also be true, by the way, of America and why Donald Trump.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this all rich democracies, I think, have been affected. One of the really important things I think about, and we don't want to romanticize the kind of the skilled manual manufacturing jobs of old. I mean, obviously they're not coming back, but there was something important about those kinds of jobs, and I think that far fewer of modern jobs have, and that was you didn't have to be highly cognitively able to do those jobs, although you might have been, but what you did need was a lot of experience to do them well. I mean, to do certain kinds of those sort of technical manual operating jobs in a factory. You didn't get good at it until you'd been doing it for 2 or 3 years, and that provided you with protection. It provided you with status protection. It meant that a double first from Cambridge, could not just walk in off the street and do that job. So, and I think we've lost a lot of those kinds of jobs. So a lot of people, I think 85-90% of jobs in Britain now, you either had to have a university degree to do, or you can learn how to do it in about half an hour. It's those sort of middle status, middle income jobs that have disappeared in such large numbers. Then, of course, in education, we've seen the more or less mono track. If you're if you're a school leaver, you should have 3 decent options: higher education, some kind of technical, vocational next stage of education, or straight into an apprenticeship in a local office or factory. And in effect, we've only had one. We've only had the university. I mean, they're massively more subsidised, even with tuition fees, massively more subsidised, massively more clearly signposted. Of course, all the teachers who have been down that route themselves are pushing everybody in that direction. But still, only 40% of our kids go down that route. There's still 60%.
My son was travelling around Bulgaria recently, and he met with all sorts of people. And one of the people he met was this electrician, sort of middle-aged electrician. And he said, listen, don't go to university, mate. I will train you up to be my apprentice. You will make so much more money. We are coining it in because no one wants to do it. No one wants to get their hands dirty. No one wants to learn the skills. Jobs like that.
No, absolutely, yeah. They're still there. The hand jobs we still desperately need. And we, just to give you an example, I think last year we had 8,000 people starting construction apprenticeships. We're meant to be building 200,000 houses a year. Meanwhile, a third of the building workers in London are born abroad. I mean, it's just, even in the short term, it is kind of idiocy the way that we've overexpanded a certain kind of higher education. I mean, I'm not saying, I don't necessarily want fewer people to go into higher education. I just think it should be much more sort of diversified, and we should have a much higher technical element to it. I mean, this is an old problem in Britain. Obviously, for various reasons, the technical and the vocational has carried less prestige than it has done in Germany, say. And we make attempts. I mean, we're sort of making one at the moment to do kind of handbrake turns on this. We've now got an apprenticeship levy. We have these T levels and so on. But I mean, it all feels a bit token, really. And there's something deep in our culture that, and it's been reinforced by anywhere domination, because of course all the anywheres have been to Russell Group universities. Their children go there. It's a world they understand. It's a world they dominate. So they just said, well, let's massively expand it and send as many people as possible there. I mean, just on some of the other things that illustrate anywhere domination, obviously there's the economic openness, represented both by the EU and the WTO. I mean, that globalization. People talk about free trade as if it doesn't come with any costs. It comes with massive costs to our politics and indeed to our kind of national life in some ways. Which is not just maybe the balance is positive. And
you mean
if
you outsource manufacturing jobs to the Chinese, say that kind of thing?
I mean, there is the double whammy of you lose your factory goes to China, and then a whole population of workers is imported to compete with you in the non-traded sector.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a new thing. I mean, but that's exactly it. I mean, that we, as a result of trade openness, some of it EU, some of it WTO as well. We're not allowed to have our own immigration policy. Obviously, we will now after Brexit. We're not allowed to have our own industrial policy. We can't take our own national decisions on these crucial areas of risk. Different countries have different attitudes to risk. So we're prepared to take a higher level of risk, say, than the Germanic countries on financial products or GM crops and things like that. We tend to worry less about them than other countries, and you end up. Both in kind of WTO and EU regimes, that they squash all these things. So countries are sort of denuded of their traditional sort of collective cultural choices. Obviously, there are internal divisions within countries too. I mean, it's not always completely clear, whether whether the majority would be, or there may be a very loud minority that are against GM crops and so on. But still, most of these things are still things that we sort of instinctively feel should be decided at the national level. But because of the level playing field that is required by free trade arrangements, all of these things have to be suppressed essentially. And of course, free trade has hugely increased human wealth, but we're getting to a point now where it is interfering in such a direct way with our sense of control. I mean, the other thing about modernity and democracy is it's meant to be about having some control over both your kind of individual and your collective life, or at least more control than your parents or grandparents or great-grandparents would have had. And yet we're taking away that control. We're sending it upstairs to all these international organisations. Now, a lot of the anywheres, they understand it. They may, they kind of probably know somebody who might work for one of these bodies, and they're relatively comfortable with it. Non-elites just see this as a complete loss of control, and it hasn't been explained to anybody. The anywheres have been very, very lazy in the way in which, partly through moral self-righteousness, because all of these things have also been associated with greater openness, high levels of immigration, greater mixing of peoples, all of these things that that are regarded as sort of unequivocally good things. So they've got a sort of moral self-righteousness when they talk about pushing things upstairs and moving things. And of course, the nation state has come out of the 20th century, or at least the first half of the 20th century, with its reputation, seriously damaged. Which is why the EU is as much a religion as it is a system of power and economics. It's a religion, and we've never been full believers. We probably moved from being agnostics to now being atheists. So we're not in the church really because of our history. We haven't needed it in the way that France, Germany, Italy, Spain have needed it. Coming out of dictatorship and destruction and so on. But there are other things too. I mean, the way the technocratic state takes things out of the democratic conflict. The independence for the Bank of England. I mean, just in the last 20 years, we've had independence for the Bank of England, huge increase in judicial activism, all the kind of human rights, sort of anti-majoritarian stuff in law, and then of course all the EU legislation, which prevents us increasing VAT on or reducing VAT on food or whatever it is.
Or taxes.
Exactly. Yeah. But now, you may argue about it may be right, but the independence of the Bank of England may be a good thing. So, but what you can bet your bottom dollar, when things are taken out of the democratic contest, they will be decided according to what I call, anywhere priorities and intuitions.
You mentioned the Bank of England, and here we are in Policy Exchange, which is the think tank you work for, which I think of as dangerously pinko centrist. But on the wall, I saw a picture of one of the people I hate more than anyone in the world, and that's Mark Carney. Now, Mark Carney, it doesn't really matter whether the Bank of England is independent or not, because Mark Carney is so much part of the globalist elite. He's so much Davos man that the way he thinks is the same way as David Cameron thought, the same way as George Osborne thinks, the same way as the GOP establishment in America thinks, the same way as the Democrats think, the same way everyone in the European Union thinks. There is this global class, the anywheres that you talk about, which have so dominated our culture that I wonder whether the little people, the people like me, who came out of our caves and voted for Brexit because it's what we believed in sovereignty and stuff. I wonder whether the system is going to crush us. Where are you on this one?
I don't think the system. I mean, I think we will have a Brexit. I do think.
Yeah, but will it be a watered down Brexit?
I think we have shifted slightly from a kind of somewhere Brexit that emphasised, ending freedom of movement and full judicial sovereignty and so on, to something that perhaps a little bit more of an anywhere Brexit, which still accepts Brexit. They kind of accept that was the, albeit small, majority decision. But I think it will happen. I mean, my worry is that we will. All the focus has been on apparently the confusion on the British side and the fact. Actually, I think the Conservative Party, to its credit, is sort of having slightly kind of behind the scenes. It's having a kind of national debate about what Brexit should be. After all, the referendum.
Why to its credit? We decided. We knew what we wanted.
Well,
we wanted to leave the single market. We wanted to stop freedom of movement. There was no question about it. The only question has to do with not with whether or not we get Brexit, but what Britain does as a country, what it does with its freedom, which is a completely separate issue. It's not about.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's quite as simple as that. I mean, I don't think we voted to leave the European Union. I mean, there are lots of different forms of that leave could take. But I think there is a pretty strong consensus. I mean, there's a very strong consensus, I think, on leaving the single market. Very strong consensus on ending freedom of movement. Perhaps slightly less strong on leaving the trade.
The customs union.
The customs union, yeah. I mean, but I think we will do that too. No, they're having this debate sort of more or less in the open. I mean, the Labour Party is sort of sniggering from the sidelines and not really taking part at all. At least the Conservative Party are sort of having the debate, and we are edging our way towards some sort of compromise on that. I don't think it'll be one that you have to worry about too much. But I think if the negotiations fail, I think there is quite a strong possibility they will. And I think the demonstrable responsibility for that will be with the EU side. I mean, we forget. I mean, one of the reasons, indeed, we're leaving the European Union. I mean, the European Union was the most extraordinary success story for the first 50 years of its life. I mean, hugely, up until the Maastricht Treaty, into the early 90s, the formation of the euro along political rather than economic lines, that was really the beginning of the end, I think, for a properly functioning European Union. It worked pretty well. Indeed, it hugely outstripped expectations. In the last 20 years, most of the big projects that it has touched haven't worked or haven't worked well. I mean, whether it's the euro, enlargement was done far too rapidly. I mean, that was partly our fault. We were the people that were promoting enlargement more than anyone else, partly because we wanted to dilute the integration forces. But yes, one of the main reasons we're leaving is because of enlargement, but because of the extra costs of it, which allowed the kind of for the sort of 350 million a week. It may be an exaggeration, but I mean we have ended up paying a lot more in as a result of enlargement, and of course freedom of movement. Those two things combined are probably the two biggest reasons for us leaving. But then look at the refugee crisis, look at the mishandling of the Ukraine crisis, the kind of the car emissions. I mean, all of these sort of second order things. So I mean, I think we kind of sit here thinking, sniggering at our own politicians. If it doesn't work, and I think there's a good chance it won't, it'll be because of the EU. I think they will screw it up because they have screwed up so much in the last decade or two, couple of decades.
Can I, before we come to the end, go off to our next thing, where we've got to go on the BBC World Service with the communist Abby Wilkinson. That'll be a laugh. Was the thing that red pilled you, as it were, the immigration issue? Because you mentioned it briefly earlier, and I was thinking Nick Cohen, another man of the left, possibly more left than you. I don't know.
Yeah,
about the set. Yeah, but I think Nick is one of the very few people on the left who's realised actually there is no compatibility between the values that made me a lefty and this kind of unholy alliance that the left has with jihadists and the way that they are destroying working class communities by through unchecked immigration. Is that something that really pushes your angry buttons?
Well, in a way, yes. I mean, I think the inability of anywheres to actually be genuinely liberal and pluralistic and see that even if they don't feel it, I mean, partly because of the life that the modern anywhere lives, which is a very mobile one. They don't tend to have very strong roots, and the group attachments that they might have had, whether national or just to sort of people like us from around here kind of attachments. They don't really have them, and they don't understand, and therefore rather look down upon, and are far too ready to see as xenophobic the kind of group attachments that most people still have. And those group attachments are very easily disturbed. I mean, I talked about the kind of achieved identity of anywheres. Well, most somewheres have what one might call ascribed identities, so that it's mainly, their sense of themselves still comes from, where they live, the group they belong to.
But also things like small details. The thing about England is that you can travel from Manchester to Liverpool, which is it's a very short distance. It's
25 miles.
25 miles. The accent is completely different. The traditions are completely different. The whole the sense of humour is different, and you can say
which is why it was very controversial. Andy Burnham, who comes from Liverpool, became the mayor of Manchester, Greater Manchester. I mean, it was a serious. Anyway, I'm just supporting your point.
He's an anywhere man, through and through, isn't he? But so you're right that this attitude of the liberal elite, the anywheres, towards people who have loyalty and fondness of their local communities and their traditions and customs and their accents, which are detectable in tiny nuances in the way people behave and the way they talk. They're rejecting actually the very thing that makes us English, aren't they?
Yeah, and of course they. The whole multiculturalism thing in the 70s and the 80s was about recognising ethnic traditions, ways of life for minorities, and saying that that societies like Britain should accommodate these differences. But
that's what it claimed to
be. But when
about.
it came to the majority ethnicity, it was as if majority ethnicities don't have an ethnicity. They don't have traditions and ways of life that they will also want to preserve up to a point. No, and we have to find a way of making, in communities and neighbourhoods, making the people from the majority community feel secure, as well as providing a space for our now quite large minority populations in many of our big cities to also feel that they have a kind of stake and in the society. And we've been very one-sided about that. And I think particularly there has been anywhere hypocrisy. They've, like I say, I have this phrase. I describe the politics of at least most somewheres. There are xenophobes and authoritarians, but I think most somewheres are what I call decent populists. So they've actually gone along with quite a lot of the great liberalisation of the last 40 years on race, on sexuality, on gender, and but they are not liberals. They still believe in the nation state. They still believe they have a kind of gut sort of attachment to the main social norms of the society, and they're anxious about high levels of immigration. They're anxious about the integration of minorities. They're anxious about the welfare state no longer being mainly contributory and welfare free riding, and they feel it, and they feel community in a way I think that many anywheres don't.
They get told by Baroness Nugent that when they fly the cross of St George outside their house,
that's an illegitimate attachment. Yeah. But they're not. I think most of them have basically decent views that group attachment do not necessitate hostility to others. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, we were a pretty racist society, and then I think group attachment did often involve hostility to the other, the unfamiliar. Britain had been a very homogeneous society, and very relatively small proportion of the population had anything to do with the empire and colonies. People talk about how this is people coming here was some sort of revenge for colonialism. Very few English and British people had very much to do with it, but there was hostility. There was a sort of a shock to the system in those relatively small number of places where you got large numbers of post-colonial immigrants coming. But we got over that, and they became part of our society. They've been absorbed into it. They're now a familiar part of the British story. But then we got the second great post-war wave of immigration starting in '97, and the numbers have just been historically unprecedented, and the change has been far too rapid, and people have objected to that. In a pretty mild way. The politicians have generally ignored it. The numbers have gone up and up and up. It's obviously one of the other factors behind the Brexit vote. But people are not. I think you can see. The number of people who, admittedly, they're being asked to judge their own feelings, but the people who admit to being very prejudiced in our society, according to the latest BSA figures, is 1%. Now, there's a much larger group who do admit to being a little bit prejudiced, who are. As almost everybody is prejudiced in some sense, they're probably just being more honest. But people want stable communities, relatively secure borders. They're not hostile to all immigration, but they want relatively modest levels of immigration. They want citizens' rights before universal rights, and they want particularly if they come from the bottom half of the social and economic spectrum. They want a narrative and structure for people who don't flourish in graduate-dominated economies. These are not big asks.
No, they're not.
And they have been largely ignored by the anywhere political class
Yeah.
in the last 20 years, and hence Brexit.
Yeah, hence Brexit. Well, we'll bring it to an end there. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, David Goodhart. Thank you and goodbye.